Okay, call to order the Village of Riverside Planning and Zoning Commission special meeting and public hearing for Monday, February 28th, 2022. Please call the roll.
Commissioner Braun,
Here.
Commissioner Marhol,
Here.
Commissioner Miller,
Here.
Commissioner Hennigan,
Here.
and Chairperson Mateo.
Here. We have a quorum. Also with us tonight is Village Attorney Lance Molina.
Hello, everyone.
For those of you who don't know him, it's been several years since you've joined us, so welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Do we have a motion to approve the minutes of the Planning and Zoning Commission regular meeting from January 26, 2022?
So moved.
I'll second. Any edits? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Nice being able to do all in favor again. Liaison report for the village board?
So at the previous board meeting on February 17th, the board reviewed the recommendation for denial for 40 Kimbark for the variation of the the fence on a corner lot and in a street yard. They followed the recommendation of planning and zoning for denying that variation, but then they also voted to send a modified proposal. It was put forth by Trustee Pollock, and that proposal pushes back the fence to 5 feet out from the primary structure, and it goes toward the rear of the property, and it would be 4 feet in height, and it would be, I believe Trustee Pollock said 50% open, so the slats would have to be a specific size. I can't remember what he said specifically. And so the Board of Trustees sent this back down to Planning and Zoning to review and to weigh against the standards to then either have Planning and Zoning uphold the original denial or to modify their recommendation to then send it back to the board for approval or denial.
Thank you. That's why it's under continued business for old business.
Chairperson Mateo, I'll also, if I may, add to the board report.
Please.
Okay, so you'll remember a couple of months ago, Planning and Zoning Commission sent a text amendment regarding accessory structures to home occupation to the village board for consideration. At that time, they wanted to consider that language further, and so we were to go back to them on February 17th with an update on that report. So where it stands now is that we have a couple of suggestions for a red line text that will go back to the village board for just discussion, make sure we're along the right kind of framework to pursue, and if they say yes, then that accessory structures text will return to you at a later date. So I just wanted to give an update there as well. Thank you.
Moving on, let's call to order the public hearing and recommendation for PZ 22-02, a variation from Section 1073D2, accessory structures and uses of the Village of the Riverside zoning ordinance to allow the construction of a deck addition 5 feet from grade, and from Section 1010-4C, nonconforming buildings and structures of the zoning ordinance to allow an existing nonconforming deck to be enlarged by 238 square feet. Location is 490 Uvedale Road, and the petitioners are Deborah and Martin Lubeck. All commissioners are still present. The public notice was published in the Riverside Brookfield Landmark on February 9th and will be entered into the record as an exhibit. So those who are going to give testimony about that, if you can, please stand up and raise your right hand. It's exciting. Is the testimony you're about to give true to the best of your knowledge? Yes. Thank you. Village summary?
Okay, so the property at 490 Uvedale, the petitioners came to us because they have current deck in the rear of the property, and they wish to expand it, like the agenda says, by about 238 square feet. So it would fit within the width of the house. They would extend it out a little bit more. I believe it's by like 12 feet. And the reason for they're wanting to expand it is they wanted to install a hot tub and just enlarge that existing deck that is currently there. After doing a little bit of research, the house has a door that gives it basement access through the rear. And the survey from 1998 shows some stairs going down to lead to that door. And sometime in 2004, there was a landing installed above that rear door with some stairs that led to the backyard. And then sometime between 2004 and 2017, the current deck was built. I couldn't find any record of it in our files. I couldn't find any permits for the current existing deck and for the previous set of stairs that was installed in the back. The current existing deck is 5 feet from grade to accommodate that basement access door in the rear. So the petitioners are seeking a variation as well for the proposed enlargement to also be 5 feet from grade. 'Cause otherwise, if they were to get rid of the deck and go 4 feet, they wouldn't have access to that rear door. The ordinance states that 4 feet from grade is what the limit is, and Commissioner Miller asked earlier why that was. I couldn't find information in the ordinance as to why. I asked the building inspector that we have if there's any particular reason why that would be 4 feet. He said he can't think of anything other than maybe just the village trying to avoid second-story decks in the rear of homes. But it does follow as long as it follows the building code. The building code doesn't explicitly prohibit anything higher than 4 feet. But that was kind of what we figured is maybe the village wanted at some point to avoid second-story decks. So they chose the 4 feet from grade level. What else am I missing? And like the ordinance states, because it is non-conforming, it can't be enlarged, and they are proposing to enlarge it to accommodate the hot tub. And in terms of impervious surface, it's a big lot. It's a double lot, it looks like, so it wouldn't affect that percentage of what is already there. As far as setbacks go, the rear and the side setbacks, wouldn't be affected in any way. And the deck itself is right behind the house, so you wouldn't be able to see it from the front, from the street if you're driving on Uvedale. And like I said, it's right in the middle of the property, so it's pretty far back from the property line, so you wouldn't really have an issue in terms of seeing anything or it blocking anybody's view or anything like that. So, yep.
Questions for staff at this point?
Remind me, and this is me recollecting from memory, so it's not going to be very good. There is a building code rule about stepping out of one's doors to the exterior. They're not supposed to step down, I believe.
I would have to double check. I don't
And
know
I,
off the
like I
top of
said,
my
I
head.
can't quite remember, and I didn't look it up,
remember.
so.
My recollection of when we were having that discussion, we were talking about porches and stoops. Is
Right.
that you have to have some type of a landing of some size.
Correct.
Immediately outside the door. like
Yes.
3 feet by 3 feet for safety or something.
Right.
That's correct.
And
It
so
was an
the
As
exist,
opposed to just a step, a
Yeah.
12-inch step. It has to be, yeah.
Right.
so the current deck does satisfy that.
Correct,
Having
yeah.
a place to step out from and being at the same level as the floor on the inside.
Correct. And then there are stairs that go into the backyard, but that's further off of the the back door.
Okay, Mr. and Mrs. Lubeck, when do you want to go to the podium?
No.
Is this an opportunity for you to sort of restate your request?
And I think that they did a beautiful job just summarizing it. The way that the deck is situated, it allows us to access the back of our house, both from the deck and then the stairs into the basement. And having a deck at 4 feet would prohibit both of those from happening. We are fortunate that we have a big lot, and so we would like to expand the size of the deck to be able to use that space a little bit more as a family. It doesn't impact any of the sightlines from the street, from the neighbors. It just gives us more space as a family to enjoy our yard before we're into the grass in the back of the yard.
Questions for the petitioners?
Can you explain where the basement door is compared to, say, the
Right
door on the
underneath it.
second? It's right below the
It's right
French
below
doors?
it. Yeah, both doors are right stacked.
And your intention is to replace what's existing there fully, like
Fully.
reconstruct it?
Like-
With new materials?
With new, much prettier materials.
What is the current look of the deck or materials?
Right now, it's
versus-
like
replaced.
just traditional decking. We're going to use composite decking material. The current railings, and I think that you spoke about this, that you guys don't have a record of that deck being built. That was before we bought the house. The current, even the railings are not really probably spaced appropriately.
You mean the uprights for safety for like
Yeah.
a child or something too?
Yeah.
How far are they right now? Sorry.
I don't know. I've never measured, but definitely not standard.
So current,
So, Mr. Lubeck, we need everything to be heard at the podium, so either one or both. You can both stand there, please. It's just for the recording.
Yep. Yeah, it's roughly probably about 12 inches, so it's not to code.
and current standard is 4 inches. Code would be no more than a 4-inch.
And everything will be done to code once it's replaced.
And can you explain about the siding that I think it said you installed last year? on the
Yeah,
back?
so we just put in hardy board siding. The exterior needed to be replaced. We bought it from the bank, so there was a lot of work needed to be done to the house. So we just had all new siding put on, and they built it around the ledge of the deck. So if we did have to lower it, we'd have to replace all that siding. in the back
Because
of the
the
house.
siding is vertical. It's
It's a
not like
vertical.
typical
Yeah, it's batten
horizontal.
board.
It's
vertical.
batten board, yeah.
Any other questions? Is there anybody in the audience that would like to comment? Francisco, did we receive any comments
Nope, no comments.
since the agenda?
Nope.
Okay. All right, final remarks? Once we close the public portion of the hearing, then the discussion will just be amongst the commissioners and staff. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions now for staff? All right, is there a motion to either continue or close the public hearing?
I'll move to close the public hearing.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. What are your thoughts?
The owners are, just to restate some facts, I think the current deck is situated between the first floor at the proper level, and then immediately below is the existing basement door, which from the picture, there's not a lot of room to lower the deck without obstructing that basement door. From the owner's statements, the deck's in poor shape, and at least portions of it do not meet current code. So if they do replace it, then they have to upgrade it to code, at least on the railing portion, which is a safety issue. I don't have any immediate objections to what we're seeing.
I think that, and this is not a new home, so the fact that you have an existing home built with that door entrance at 5 feet above ground sort of forces the issue and also creates a circumstance that's not going to apply to every home in town.
I would agree with those assessments, both of those assessments.
Okay.
I mean, for me, those are all relevant factors, as well as the fact that the siding was just put down and would have to be totally replaced. If that weren't the case, I might see it slightly differently, but that does seem like a hardship that they would have to replace all of that whole rear of their house just for the point of, you know, reconstructing a deck, which only they see, which is in their backyard, which is a large backyard with they're well within all the setbacks, just to comply with a 4-foot requirement that is in the code for some reason that isn't clear to me.
Would anybody like to make a motion?
Motion to approve the variance of the deck of a 5-foot height above ground rather than 4 foot.
Is there a second?
I would second that motion.
Let's go through the standards. The first one, and this is on page 9, those of you who are going digital. Because of a particular physical or other unusual condition of the specific property involved, a particular hardship or practical difficulty to the owner would result, as distinguished from mere inconvenience, if the strict letter of the regulations were to be carried out. Such conditions may include, but are not limited to, the presence of an existing use or structure, whether conforming or non-conforming, irregular or substandard shape or size, exceptional topographical features, or other extraordinary physical condition peculiar to and inherent in the subject property that amounts to more than a mere inconvenience to the owner and that relate to or arises out of the lot and/or structures thereon rather than the personal situation of the current owner of the lot, or situations in which the ordinance prevents the owner from reestablishing, restoring, or maintaining a material feature or significant architectural feature related to the lot or structure, or from maintaining the architectural integrity of the lot or structure.
That's true. Sorry, Commissioner.
I was going to say, I think that condition is met because of the existence of both the house with the door, how it's located, the fact of the current condition of the house with the new siding, and the fact of an existing deck structure, you know, and et cetera. So I think that's met because of the existing structure, even though it is non-conforming.
Anything to add? So it's both the existing use or structure, as you pointed out, non-conforming, and it would prevent the owners from restoring a deck that needs to be restored. Second, the purpose of the variation is not based primarily upon a desire to increase financial gain. I think that's fine. C, the alleged difficulty or hardship has not been created by any person presently having an interest in the property.
Created prior to ownership.
D, the conditions upon which the petition for variation is based would not be applicable generally to other property within the same zoning classification.
This is specific to the arrangement of the doors and the level, the height of the first floor above ground.
Okay. E, the granting of the variation will not be detrimental to the public welfare or injurious to other property improvements in the neighborhood in which the property is located.
We've heard no objections to this, and it's in the backyard where it's, according to staff, it's not visible to the public.
Right. We've heard no evidence of any impact on neighbors or drainage or anything else.
The granting of the variation will not alter the essential character of the neighborhood.
That's true.
That's true.
And finally, the proposed variation will not impair an adequate supply of light or air to adjacent property or substantially increase the congestion of the public streets or increase the danger of fire or impair natural drainage or create drainage problems on adjacent properties or endanger the public safety or substantially diminish or impair property values within the neighborhood.
That's correct.
Correct.
Okay. so we seem to be in agreement that the standards have been met. Are we ready to vote, or do we want more discussion?
I'm ready to vote.
Okay, please call the roll.
Commissioner Braun,
Aye.
Commissioner Marhol,
Aye.
Commissioner Miller,
Aye.
Commissioner Hennigan,
Aye.
and Chairperson Mateo.
Aye. Our motion carries. This is a recommendation that will go to the village board, probably their second meeting in March.
Yes.
I'll get back to you. Thanks for coming. March 17th? Next on our agenda is old business. A, continued discussion and review of transit-oriented development code update. It's on page 27 of the digital agenda for those looking for it.
Okay. I will attempt to keep this brief and let you lead the discussion on this item. So at the last Planning and Zoning Commission meeting on January 26th, we broached the subject of the transit-oriented development code update, zoning code update. And we walked through just an additional or initial introduction for these plan code updates. The amount of material was large enough that upon general consensus, the idea was to kind of break up a conversation about each of these things before moving them forward to discuss code changes during a public hearing. So the purpose of these code amendments was all rooted in this idea of making property in our business districts and so B1, B2 specifically, more transit-friendly, pedestrian-oriented, allow for bicycle safety and accessibility, bike parking. And so part of that is to adjust some of these code requirements in order to promote such things. Along with that, I know there was a question asked, well, what does it mean to prepare the corridor? They keep talking about preparing a corridor for this active transportation. And when we think about that in the planning world, it's kind of like, what are the hindrances in that area or by code that would prevent increased bulk or density, specific parking configurations, specific signage allowances, what types of creative ways can the right-of-way or sidewalk area be used? How easy is it to promote sidewalk cafes and dining if that's what a community is hoping for? What type of signage might a transit corridor require? If we currently have a code that doesn't allow digital signage in particular areas, but the transit corridor would prefer that or requires it because they're doing so in every other place along that corridor outside of Riverside, what does that look like for us, and how can we apply that to our code in an appropriate way? So that's sort of what this includes. We, of course, are looking at a lot of the things I'm talking about maybe today, but certainly the code update also touches on other parts of our zoning code. So looking at certain types of review required for changes to school property or institutions, looking at height and density in various locations within the village. And so we'll talk about each of those things in turn, but I figured it was easiest to break up the conversation and in manageable kind of bites. And so what we chose for today to talk through and just get a sense of whether the steering committee, so there was a TOD steering committee that prepared changes along with the planning consultant team. And we just want to know whether those are on target, whether you want to see the proposed code changes brought for a public hearing and to the village board for adoption. But you need to look at it through your lens of what is appropriate for adoption in Riverside, and are these, proposed changes appropriate in the locations they're described for. So I was reminded that, one, I looked at a calendar and I recognized that the public hearing date publishing for a March meeting is past. So what we'll be doing is, it's because we held it on a different day, unfortunately. But the good news is the sign code is not part of our zoning code and doesn't require a public hearing, but certainly does, I would say staff wants to have the Planning and Zoning Commission weighing in on each of those things. And so what we'd like to do is discuss the sign code updates, discuss the potential for a B1 TOD zoning district, which was in your memo, and then there's just a related small segment about window use in business districts that applied kind of similarly to the sign code changes. And what we can do is bring forward the items that do require a public hearing, when that next public hearing opportunity comes along. Or, the commission has the opportunity to hold a special meeting if you choose to you really want to break it up or get into detail. So I'm sorry I said I was going to be brief, but I wanted to give that overview. So essentially what the memo did, I highlighted in blue what items kind of would be addressed, right? We had some things that were inconsistent or needed improvement per the scope of work. And then we have proposed changes that hopefully address these issues or goals that we want to accomplish. And so the blue is just an indication that by discussing the potential for a B1 TOD zoning district and discussing the sign code, you kind of touch on those topics. That's the intent. So in the memo, just so you follow along, and I won't go through in detail unless you want me to, but I just picked each topic. The sign code, I included the memo information from the planning consultant. I included the applicable charts that described and redlined the changes, and any staff notes that would go with that particular subject. So, Chairperson Mateo, how would you like to conduct this conversation? Or do you want me to walk through these items and introduce a topic before there's discussion, or how do you want to do that?
Let's go item by item,
Okay.
and some will have more conversation than others.
Okay. So, I guess the highlights, and I didn't, include a section on each red line within this document, but we started with the sign code. And one thing to note is that there's a segment that's added to describe no discrimination against non-commercial signs or speech. So we cannot regulate signage based on the content of that signage. So this code section just addresses a decision of a legal decision, national legal decision, and incorporates that into our code regulation. So it's, Part B says that the purpose of the provision is to prevent any inadvertent favoring of commercial speech over non-commercial speech or favoring of any particular non-commercial message over any other non-commercial message. So, and it also doesn't create a right to increase the amount of signage, on that site. So any questions or thoughts about 432 in the criteria section of our sign code? Questions? No? No.
I think, I just had one comment. From what I read, I think whatever's put on the sign still has to relate to the use of the building, right? I mean, you can't
Yes.
just put down whatever profane or non-profane comment there, right? It has to,
Right, the
Yes.
idea behind that, it's a savings clause that grows out of the Reed versus Town of Gilbert case that came out of Arizona. It's a Supreme Court case that everybody's been struggling with. And it basically said in a very broadly written opinion by Justice Thomas that if you have to read the sign in order to know what regulation applies, because municipal sign codes tended to have categories of signage. There'd be rules for real estate signs, there'd be rules for garage sale signs, there'd be rules for, but this case basically said that if your rules are set up that way, they're probably all unconstitutional. Because if you have to read a sign, read the letter of a sign in order to know which set of rules applies, that's content-based. Previous to that case, the courts took a very practical view. They said that if the regulation isn't targeting the content itself, but it just categorizes, it's not necessarily content-based. Once a speech regulation is determined to be content-based, there's a 99% chance it won't be upheld because the standard is compelling public purpose, extremely narrowly served by the regulation, almost impossible to meet. So that's what, so a lot of the codes, it's hard to get rid of those categories. I mean, I've done it, but a lot of codes don't yet, and so they put this savings clause in, basically to say no non-commercial speech is going to be disfavored based upon content. It's like a savings clause. And the distinction between commercial and non-commercial goes back to an earlier Supreme Court case that talks about the commercial speech is slightly not quite as favored as non-commercial speech because the kind of speech that the Constitution most protects is political speech. It's policy speech, not sales speech. So.
and signs specifically identified as relating to the business of the business as opposed to just like someone puts a poster in a window or something, or is all of that treated the same way? Do you know what I mean? Like,
no, they would be treated differently because the signage itself of a business does need to relate to the business, but businesses have the ability, subject to content-neutral regulations, like you can't plaster up more than a certain percentage of your window space, for example. That's content neutral, but you have the right to put up flyers from other groups that want to put them up in your window, whether it's for a church group or a public, whatever it is.
okay.
But as long as you're not covering up more than you're entitled to, those would be okay.
Thank you for the good summary. Should I move on?
Any other questions? Okay.
Okay, so 433 was also of note. This is our definition section, and as I understand it, there's been past discussion about how to measure a sign's natural grade. And so we've included a definition for how to determine the natural grade and establishing an allowed height of a sign, right? So a ground sign all the way up to something taller. So this just reads grade natural, the pre-construction elevation at the level of the street closest to the sign to which the sign is oriented, measured at the street's center line. Notwithstanding the foregoing, if the sign is located not less than 75 feet from the right-of-way, grade, in quotes, shall mean the average ground elevation of the lot on which the sign is located. So if there are recommendations or concerns about how we would determine that, we certainly could take feedback.
I had two comments on that. I think in the third line where it says sign is located not less than 75 feet, I would think it'd be better to just say more than 75 feet rather than not less than a double. I mean, I had to really think about what that. And then I really don't understand what it means, the pre-construction elevation at the level of the street. you're talking about the level of the street, it doesn't matter what the pre-construction elevation of the property is. So I'm just confused about that, how that applies.
Do you look at this at all? No. Oh, okay. Well. So the only thing that I can come up with is if this is a new development or a redeveloped site where there would be just, dirt where, for whatever reason, before they restore that area, or raise that grade in any way, that they would have put in some kind of foundation or electrical
Right.
work
But
there.
what does it mean then, measured at the street's center line? How does the street's center line connect to the pre-construction elevation on the property? I just don't understand. It's not clear to me, and maybe it is
Yeah.
to someone else, but.
We could certainly ask the consultant team if that's just standard language that they might have used elsewhere, or do you have any conversation about this during the steering committee meeting prior, or is this something that maybe that prior staff had determined?
I think the intention is that the grade be measured at the street center line, as long as
Sure.
that sign's within 75 feet. I just don't think that sentence really gets there in a
Tells
very good way.
Okay.
Yeah, part of the issue, and I can't help because it is somewhat confusing language, but part of what you would need to do whenever you're looking at, this is a definition, whenever you're looking at a definition, you should look at how the term is used in the substantive rules, and we don't have any of those in front of us. And so it might be easier to understand what it's getting at if you looked at those, because typically, you add definitions to avoid vagueness when you're using certain terms. And so part of our difficulty here is not having how grade natural is used in the substantive regulations. The only other comment I would say is if we want to keep the content the same and we want to change the not less, we should say 75 or more, because not less includes 75 itself. If you just say more than 75, you sort of change it ever so slightly.
There's a diagram showing how to measure.
Oh, is it?
It's not in a
It's not in the memo.
Oh.
It's in the full sign code packet. But it does immediately follow that.
Yeah,
So the
but
diagram
typically,
shows.
when you're saying the pre-construction elevation, it's before, before anyone's touched it, because grade is very easy to change, and it can be manipulated, and so this tries, I think, to set a level playing field about, what do we mean when we say a sign has to be only so high, or can only be so high, or has to be at least so high. It's always tied to grade, and you can mess with grade. So
Well-
this tries to eliminate that.
I follow the argument, The fact that you're referring back to the street center line elevation is not something that a developer can easily manipulate.
Yeah, I think that's a good.
Unless there's other village work in the area, the street center line is fairly fixed.
Stable, right?
Stable, fixed, consistent.
I think that's fine. Then I just don't understand why that first part of the sentence is there, the pre-construction elevation. Why not just say the natural grade is measured at the center line of the street, adjacent to the property, or whatever that is? Why not?
Yeah, probably because the substantive regulations probably refer to height on a wall, right? So it's not actually the height from the center line, looking at it from a sort of an absolute sense, but you establish where the bottom of the wall is by looking at the pre-construction grade, even if that's been changed slightly, if that makes sense.
You're looking at it relative to something else, and that's what we're trying to define as what is that relative thing that we're looking at? It's either, if we're far enough away from the street, it's the average property elevation.
Right.
Or if we're not 75 feet away, then we are looking at the center line elevation of the road. So Commissioner Miller I think the language could be improved, but the concept is still valid.
As long as it's understandable by someone, that's fine with me.
Yeah, well, and if this goes through a public hearing, this was done by a consultant. I don't think we've had any input on this yet, so those kinds of tweaks. Once you decide that this is something you want to recommend or you want to go in this direction, we can clarify a little better.
Okay. Shall I move on? Okay. I will also note, I have an extra copy of the memo if anyone would like it, so. Okay, so there's quite a bit more of the sign code itself that it was not, strictly defined inside this 16-page memo, because it's, there are various changes. We are certainly open to any questions or thoughts about other elements of the sign code specifically. We wanted to highlight that one thing that was pulled out in initial discussion as a highlight by the consultant team was thinking about, along the lines of the sign code, property maintenance for storefront windows. And so back in the zoning code, they essentially create a caveat that all window sign standards shall adhere to the requirements established in Chapter 3. So 10.5.7D5, storefront window displays. The Chapter 3, it just says signs, which summarizes appropriate sign types, materials, maintenance, etc. for window signs. And so it's just a reference back into and controls the signs that, that would apply in window areas of the business district, both in B1 and B2 commercial districts. Let me see. There's an additional table that I included in the memo that specifies the B1 zoning district sign standards. And it's just noted that the window signage isn't changed, but for that signs are limited to the first floor only in the B1 commercial districts. So you wouldn't have other business signage on that second or higher floors in those districts. And then, let me see, okay. So Commissioner Miller had a question about whether this was, there's a T1, I'm sorry, here. So the memo cuts off at the B1 TC subdistrict, so that is the transitional commercial subdistrict. So we think about that as getting closer into neighborhoods. And that section also limits the window signage to just the first floor. The others are just slight changes to the existing sign requirements for awnings, canopies, and projecting signs, adding 8 feet, 6-inch clearance requirement from the prior 8-foot clearance. So a little bit higher, that anything coming out of the building as a projection would end up giving a little bit more height than the past requirement. Yeah.
On the B1C table, on the wall sign, it indicates it's either the second floor or the cornice, whichever's lower. And then on the projecting sign, it seems to allow someone to go up to the second floor. So I'm curious why there's that difference. The projecting sign would allow someone to put a sign essentially as high as they want. Was that the intent?
It looks like
It
they
doesn't
didn't
have the
make
same
that red line.
restriction or lower. So was that the goal, or am I missing something? Where it says top of
Yeah.
building, so top of building would indicate 24 feet or above that second floor line.
Well, certain different types of signage can certainly be, have a difference in the way that they're installed. The projecting signs, there may be a reason or rationale to have something, coming out from the building at the top of that building is a identifier of some kind, potentially, that wouldn't be the same or give off that same appearance as having a, 8x6 wall sign right at the top of the building underneath underneath that roof
Underneath
line.
that second floor window.
Yeah.
That's where I'm going, is the projecting sign would be allowed to be much, much higher than everything else.
So if you look at the table, you see that they changed it for the wall sign. They struck out and they added the red line. And it's just not clear. I think you're right. Did they just fail to do that for the projecting sign? Was that a mistake or was it intentional?
Yeah, it seems as though that same language, whichever is lower, should also be in the projecting sign one.
And thank you, that's a
Yeah.
much better summary than what I was trying to do.
And I wanted to note for the projecting sign too, I mean, I'm sure the consultants have looked at this, but 4314D3 also references that 10-foot level, so that would have to be conformed to what the table says
Could you
for
please,
projecting signs, 4-3-14D3. And I had two other questions about this table. For one, what would be the reason to lower, does it say the change for awning signs and canopy signs? Is the minimum change to 8'6" in each of those? Is that what an additional 6 inches was added?
I think so.
Can't read it, okay. All right, well, I guess that's not a big deal then. I thought it said 6 feet, but, and the second one, second comment I had was, I'm not a sign person, but if we're talking about sidewalks, along the Pace Pulse corridor, where we want it to be transit-friendly and all the rest, I don't understand why monument signs are more pedestrian-friendly than pole signs. It seems to me monument signs would take up more room on the sidewalk than a pole sign. So that's my comment there.
it might be a reference to basically our eye line is naturally in a certain frame of reference, and so looking up to a pole sign may be less pedestrian friendly, although you're absolutely correct in taking up the space and the volume of walkability. The monument sign is kind of just right there in front at your eye level, giving the street itself a more pedestrian kind of feel and awareness rather than looking upwards.
Okay, well, that's a good explanation,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think that's the intent.
And regarding a monument sign, we aren't changing our right-of-way requirements. The monument sign is still required to be on the owner's property, so it's not extending into the public way.
Correct.
So other than being a visual barrier possibly, it's certainly not a pedestrian barrier. It does not prevent travel. It does not restrict traffic flow in any way.
Depending on what type of pole signage would be used in a particular, downtown area, there are benefits to using a monument sign as a wayfinding sign potentially. So there's plenty of places that have like a kiosk or some other use for the kind of podium, column type sign rather than a stick with a sign at the top of it as well.
And I'll pick on possibly a certain famous fast food place, but many pedestrian-friendly central business districts have restricted very tall signs, and they've required that famous sign to be at ground level, so it's not quite so in your face, it's not so obtrusive, and that is probably the goal of eliminating the pole sign in favor of the monument sign.
Okay. Any other comments on that item? Or on any aspect of the sign code in your review of the sign code? Was there anything that struck you as concerning, questions, about particular changes or recommendations?
In the definitions, it's got projecting / blade sign. The table should be updated to use the same naming.
That it looks like they did that in the B2 standards, but did not do that in the B1 table.
I would suggest make sure that anything that's defined has the exact same name in the table so that we don't get into debates about interpretation.
It's part of the challenge right now as it stands between the B2 and the B1 sign codes.
Understood.
Okay, very good. Well, the last aspect that I,
Just one
Oh, go
thing.
ahead.
Looking at your memo.
Yes.
I was reading the storefront display windows text that you
Yes.
printed out. There were two things there. I thought the red line part that says window sign standards shall adhere to requirements established in Chapter 3. So that should also say of Title 4
oh, yes.
of the code, not just Chapter 3. And then also, in the existing text, it puzzles me that maybe the consultant has gotten to this, but it says, on the second line, shall be display-type windows where retail sales, personal service, and/or office use is located on the first floor. So it seems to only apply where there's an existing use of a retail sale, a personal service, and/or an office use. And I'm wondering if in our existing code, if that should be altered at all. There could be other situations. Do we want storefront windows for other types of uses, like there are microbreweries, restaurants, art instruction, schools, all the rest that could be allowed in the whatever it is, B2 district. So I'm just wondering if it should be expanded a little bit, if someone should think about that. And then, of course, I get to the question of, well, what if something's used as like, a dentist office, and it switches to not a retail sale, personal service, and/or office use? Is it okay then for the person to get rid of the window and brick it up? Is that what we intend? Is that what, the village wants? Is that what's transit, pedestrian friendly?
Yeah, I wonder if the intention is just any type of non-residential use.
Yeah, then that could be, right, because again, dwellings are allowed on the first floor. So you don't want that,
Right.
But I just think it's maybe outdated language that could be cleaned up a little.
Is that, I was going to say, is that percentage something that you want to keep, essentially? I'm not trying to introduce some new ideas, but certainly I think the intent of having these display windows is to, generate interest in what's happening in that space, and especially as a retail use or other type of entertainment or other type of services, to understand partially we take an interest from a village enforcement side because it's helpful to know what's happening inside that space. There's a reason that we don't want those ground floor windows completely covered with signage. There's a percentage of that sign area that's permitted. And, but there are buildings and instances where it's challenging to meet that percentage, or places that have an abundance of window area. And so, I guess just to clarify, do we need to specify the use within that, or is the idea on a ground floor to have a certain amount of open window coverage?
Thoughts?
The facade references the whole first floor, like, would that be 12 feet by 12 feet high, 14 feet high? You're including that whole area, and you're talking about 50%, right?
Yes, so when we look at a measurement of a wall area, if it was 100 square feet on that wall area, 10 feet high by 10 feet wide, we'd hope to see, 50 square feet remained windows in some configuration of that area. And yeah, especially as they're street front facing. The buildings that don't have a side of this, side facing the street aren't necessarily required to have a full wall of windows on their first floor in the back, loading area, for example.
I personally don't have a sense for what would be appropriate.
Sure.
So,
And I'm wondering if it should say at least 50% shall be a window. Because in theory, they could go
That's-
higher, right?
yeah, that makes sense.
Any other comments on this? You will get a chance to, walk through any final kind of recommendations as well.
I'm still puzzled by the difference between pylon and pole signs, and Constable suggested not allowing pole signs in B1, so maybe we should not allow pylon signs either. And then one proposed change is for gas station canopies going forward, the only portion of the canopy that can be lit under the proposed amendment would be the lettering and the logo or logo itself, and not the rest of the canopy. I haven't looked at our current gas stations to see if that would make them non-conforming if we accept that, but I'll try to look at them at night before our next meeting.
Okay.
I'll admit that my recollection is poor, but I think at least one of them has light all the entire perimeter. But I could be wrong. I might be remembering something older.
Other thoughts from the sign code? Okay.
Okay. So the last item to discuss on this evening is whether to establish a B1 TOD zoning district. So the overview of the overview of this states it well. The amendments in this section focus on updating the set of zoning districts with the proposed B1 transit-oriented development district, and ensures the zoning code and zoning map are consistent in labeling district names. So the idea here is, and just noting in the memo, it just says that section 10.3.1 proposed, changes and updates those to reflect the same wording. So B1C would change from a business district to the retail business commercial. We have a B1TC, which exists, but it would be named Retail Business District Transitional Commercial. And then the creation of a B1 TOD, Retail Business District TOD. So simple in general. I included in the memo a zoning map as proposed. this, I'll just kind of explain that we do have an existing B1 district, commercial district in this location, both in economic development business district and the B1 zoning. And so what has happened here is that it very closely mirrors the area indicated for that, the economic business district 2, and except for the transitional commercial, which is aligned with Burlington Street. So it kind of from north to south matches that area in that area. And so the purpose, I'm sorry, on the purpose of this, creating this district is, again, going back to that idea of supporting development close to aforementioned transit facilities along Harlem Avenue. Key elements include providing zoning standards that limit ground floor office, so coding as inactive ground floor uses, reinforces the maintenance of storefront window displays, adds emerging employment-generating uses that support transit. Other aspects of this is that they're updating building height standards, so would provide for a minimum height standard and increase the maximum height by an extra story, or 12 feet, which would be intended to facilitate greater transit supportive density without significantly altering the physical character of the business district and adjacent neighborhoods. So you're talking about a minimum building height of 2 stories, and then with potential for a taller building if appropriately zoned. So there are aspects of this, the packet itself, cited in 10.5.2, it makes the changes that includes the new explanation of the B1 TOD subdistrict. It also adjusts the existing definitions of the commercial subject district and the transitional commercial subject district, and adds the comments about creating a pedestrian and bicycle-friendly environment with safe access to transit. So thoughts on anything here? I also included the bulk and use requirement tables in case that was something you want to speak to. They specifically identify the change for the the minimum building height.
Questions?
I have a number of thoughts on all of this. I was somewhat confused at the beginning of the process, and I thought, well, we're creating this B1 TOD in order to create a transit-supportive new area. But then when I look at the text of what is the B1C and the proposed B1 TOD, and I look at the uses allowed, and I look at the other changes, they seem remarkably similar to me. There seems to be a slightly greater emphasis on mixed use in the definition for the B1 TOD. And there's reference to the railroad and transit supportive versus, it says transit supportive in the C for the B1 TOD district and along major roadways and nearby transit facilities for the B1C. But I really see very little functional difference between the two. One example of that is that in the new text for the B1 TOD, it says residential uses are permitted above the ground floor only. But if you look at the uses, that's not actually true. Townhouses are now allowed in the B1 TOD, I think the B1C, and first floor dwellings are allowed. They're called a special use, but my understanding of what a special use is that it's still an allowed use. It's just that conditions can be put on that use. So it's not permitted. So
Well,
these things were added.
Not strictly true. A special use is potentially allowed in a zoning district, but it has to be allowed site by site depending on the surroundings. So it's not, it's allowed, but we can put conditions. It's foreseeably allowed, not necessarily.
But it would be very hard if someone said they wanted to like put an office on the first floor, to go through our special use standards and to say that you can't have the office. I mean, given our special use standards, I just think it would be very hard to deny that use.
And that could be. Yeah.
And so whereas currently, some of those things aren't allowed at all. It seems like we expanded what was allowed, not reduced what was allowed. For instance, again, like with townhouses, they're not allowed now. But under this proposal, they would be allowed. So so in the B1 Todd, dwelling townhouse is permitted. And dwelling townhouse for the B1C is special use, where it didn't exist before. So I'm just not clear. And then another question I had, and I sent this to Ashley, and she probably doesn't know at all, but I don't understand why the B1 Todd was limited to the area where it is right now, which is part of the old B1C. If there was really a desire to increase density and transit area and all the rest, and there's references to how far people walk, within a half a mile of a train station or even a mile people walk, why wasn't it extended further north along Harlem into the R4 and the office districts? Those are very large pieces of property if we're interested in redevelopment with large front yards. And I was just wondering about that also.
Here's a good point about discrepancies between proposed B1C and B1 TOD, where some cases it's special, in other cases it's permitted. And I don't recall rationales for that. Commissioner Hennigan, do you have any memory?
I do not.
It is specific to the townhouses or some other?
Or the multiple family?
Well, the only thing that I can come up with is that, when you're thinking about the type of business district and an emphasis on mixed use, so if there's an emphasis on mixed use, having a multifamily dwelling building set only for people living there and not generating some activity of a business purpose, that might be why it would require additional layer of review. Townhouses, often are kind of narrow in nature, and perhaps by permitting that, but not necessarily permitting, a wide expanse of apartments may go back to that idea of having this as a corridor of business and residential properties, and where people can kind of intermingle within those uses, and so that's the only thing I can come up with just from a philosophy of what the purpose of a transit-oriented area or development looks like, is not to fill a big car and transit corridor with just housing.
I would agree, and that's why I think maybe we should consider changing the proposed uses in B1 TOD to special use.
Okay.
Any other thoughts on that?
That sounds accurate with regards to both the philosophy of trying to encourage greater foot traffic. Residential obviously doesn't, so allowing residential as a permitted use does not help us towards our goal. Forcing, that's probably the wrong word, but encouraging a developer to provide their justification for that special use I think that's appropriate.
I was just looking at what our special use standards are, and I just think that it would be very, very hard to not allow a use say, in a building that already exists, and someone wants to just use it for, an office on the first floor, or a residence, or whatever, to say, no, under our special use standards, you can't meet the burden. I think the standards are too vague.
So
to
keep
allow-
in mind, one possibility that exists, if you're looking at a transit-oriented sort of philosophy, is the special use standards can be tailored to what you're trying to solve for.
You mean rewrite what we have in our
Have
code?
special use standards
Okay.
for those special uses within the TOD. That's possible to do, and they would address as elements the kinds of things you're talking about.
I think that would be
So
a
for
very good
example,
idea to look at
If it's an
that.
office use, they would have to justify how this particular office use would fit into this, why it's connected in some way to the transit orientation.
I think that would be a very good idea.
That's
Otherwise, I
something-
think.
that's something we
standards are
could look
just
at.
Not enforceable.
And you'd have the usual ones too with the special use, but we could tailor it more.
Right. Well, I just think Riverside special use standards are fairly limited. I looked at LaGrange special use standards. It seems a little bit, I don't have the paper with me right here now, but a little tighter, a little more demanding on what has to be
And
shown.
those can be done, that can be done.
And I'm sure there are many other villages. And then as far as, like, say, the townhouse, I just don't see why we would want to allow a townhouse in the B1 Todd. It's a very small area. It just doesn't seem to me, if we're looking for redevelopment, that that's an advisable use.
So would your suggestion be not only not to switch it from permitted to special use, but just leave that area blank, indicating that they're not allowed?
I'm not sure it's permitted now. Maybe I'd have to look at it. So right now, in the B1C, the townhouses are not allowed. According to the table, there's a blank in that cell. And the proposal is to change it for the B1C to a special use, and in the new B1 Todd, have it as a permitted use. And the dwelling at the ground floor, which is that's a new category that was created. Those are all special uses. And then there was a few others, like the assisted living. It's a special use in the B1 Todd and the B1C. And, yeah. Because I think, if the desire is to have denser development, I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but if that's the desire, denser residences, townhouses take up a lot of space. All we have to do is look at the ones on Burlington. So that's-
What are your thoughts on that? So in our current code in B1C, townhouse and multiple family, there's no designation, meaning they're not allowed. Do we want to continue that in both B1C and TOD?
I think so.
You can have townhouse, depending on the architecture, which I don't think we want to get into, I would simply make any dwelling that potentially has a ground floor entry special use. Because that way we don't get into any debates, because even dwelling at the ground floor versus dwelling multiple family, the minute you get an apartment above, it's a multifamily thing, structure. So I would make them all special use.
Rather than make them not allowed at all?
Correct. If we're going to allow for a certain amount of freedom on the part of the developer to make this wonderful proposal to us, maybe they're going to have some dwelling entries at the ground floor adjacent to this other wonderful use. So maybe they're fully developing a set of parcels. So we don't need to preclude that, but by making it special use, we get to where Attorney Molina is, which is we can put conditions on it.
Your thoughts?
I think that makes a lot of sense. Certainly, we don't want to discourage any sort of creative development proposals that someone might come up with. So allowing it as a special use allows for it, but keeping it special, not permitted, keeps the focus on the commercial development that we're really trying to focus on here. So I would be okay with it as special use.
And keep in mind, too, that you've amended the code, I don't know exactly when, time has gone by so fast, but you allow planned developments or planned unit developments now without a minimum size. So, and that's a way for creativity to come in, where you can have your existing zoning be underlying the PD, but they're saying, well, I want not variations, they don't have to meet that standard, but I want deviations from what would normally be required, and here's the public purpose as to what you're going to get as a community back, and that allows that kind of creativity. So that could weave into these areas too. It's something to keep in mind.
Commissioner Braun, any thoughts on this?
So the special use, by making it a special use, that would allow for the creativity?
No. So that's yet another layer. So
Okay.
within a zoning district, you have permitted uses, non-permitted uses, they're not allowed here, and special uses, which means they could be allowed here. They have to meet all the zoning standards, but you have to show us why this will fit here. A planned development is a way to not play by all the rules of that zoning district. They serve as a basis for what you're doing, but to ask for leniency because you're putting a package of things together that you can show will include public benefit that warrant not following the letter of the zoning requirements.
Okay.
And they come in with a plan for a parcel. You say, well, this is gonna have some retail here, we want residential on the second floor, but we're proposing putting a townhouse here, and here's why it works. And they would have to show it, and they could come at it that way as well. I just wanted to point that out, that that's an opportunity and a flexibility that's already built in your code.
So we have been discussing the PUD, but did that apply to this area?
It could apply, yes.
It could apply to any area.
I think the only place we disallowed it, remind me, is residential.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
But it also has a much longer timeline in terms of approvals and plan oversight. So I still am comfortable with changing it from permitted to special. And maybe that's a part way rather than going full bore planned unit development, that the special use does allow a certain amount of creativity, but doesn't have to go to the levels and
Sure.
planning.
I just wanted to point that out, yeah.
No,
Makes
it's a good
sense.
point.
That makes sense.
Touching on the nature of what is a special use, I found my printouts on our special use regulation and LaGrange. I just picked LaGrange for whatever reason. And ours talks about, there are two types of special uses, one public and one a private. Use is entirely private in character, but of such an unusual nature that their operation may give rise to unique problems with respect to their impact upon neighboring property. I think that's, to me, a hard reach to say an office on a ground floor is going to meet that kind of a standard. Now, LaGrange's regulation references special impact or uniqueness that requires careful review of their location, design, configuration, and special impact to determine against fixed standards desirability of permitting on any given site. And to me, there's a lot more meat there for us to make determinations. So.
Other thoughts on the districts? So the consultants proposed changes to the names of the districts in 1031, but those proposed names don't carry on to 1052. I think we just need to be consistent there and on the map. I did ask Todd why he added retail to the B1s and haven't gotten an answer yet. I'm not sure it's necessary.
guess the bottom line question is there general support for the creation of a B1 TOD distinct district? It seems so, but that's where I asked the question.
Commissioners?
Well, my opinion is that I'm okay with that, but only if it's designed in such a way that it's achieving whatever goal we're trying to achieve, because I don't really, the way I read them, it sounds that the B1 TOD is very much just like the B1C. So that's how I see it.
Biggest difference is in the bulk regulations. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
Basically adding one extra floor. That's the biggest difference I see.
Well, for us, that's big.
And we'll make sure to, we'll talk with Chairperson Mateo, but certainly the bulk regulations will be something we'll specifically focus on at a future meeting.
I think another difference here, and this is probably negated by what we were talking about earlier, but I too am having trouble distinguishing or finding enough of a difference between the definition of B1C and B1 TOD. And I think we were just talking about making in B1 TOD dwelling for townhouse, for instance, making that a special use in TOD. And by doing so, we've narrowed, or we've made the B1C and the B1 TOD even more similar by doing that. I could be totally off base, but I thought that, in my mind, one of the benefits or one of the distinctions between the B1C and the B1 TOD or the transit is to have residences in order to encourage people to use the transit system.
It is, that's
And,
one of the.
and by making that in B1, making townhomes in the B1 TOD special and not permitted, is that discouraging that in some way? I'm fine with the justification of making it a special use for townhomes anywhere, but that, in my mind, makes the purpose of the B1 TOD lessened. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I certainly get that, part of the being transit supportive is having potential transit users. So we definitely want to allow for that, but I lean toward it being special rather than permitted only because there are certain sites that I don't know that I would be okay with it on. And if it were permitted, then we would really have no say in that.
And I respect that, and I agree with that. Then why do we need a distinction then between B1C and B1 TOD if we're allowing the same type of development as a special use?
Got it.
Except for that bulk.
Except for the bulk.
Except for the
Right.
Except for the bulk
The
change.
idea being that you can have more residential and you have less concern about parking because of the proximity. So some of those kinds of concerns when you have the greater density. Well, what if everyone has a car? What if everyone has two cars?
Right.
The idea, if you're in this district, that becomes less of a concern because there's an assumption that there'll be far fewer of that. So, but there are a lot of similarities, no question.
Yes. You bring up a good point with parking. You bring up a good point.
And we are permitting dwellings above the ground floor. So that residential use, as long as you're one story up, is always there.
So maybe the way I visualize a townhouse is a freestanding, something that starts on the ground floor, perhaps in the basement, goes up, and is one unit. Is that what a townhouse is? Because in that case, it doesn't matter if we allow 5 stories in the B1 TOD, 60 feet. If you're going to put a townhouse there, That's it.
But you could have I'm imagining a ground floor commercial with townhouses stacked on top.
So is that a thing? I mean, is that still considered a townhouse? A townhouse is simply a narrow vertical building, but it doesn't have to start on the ground floor?
I think it just depends. I know that I have seen some developments where, as Commissioner Marhol was talking about, a ground entry door, but then they go up to a second story and above into second, third stories,
But is that a townhouse, I guess?
Well,
Or is that just multifamily dwelling?
I
you know?
suppose it depends on how that development is defined. So it's possible that it would be a townhouse development with office space on the first floor as you go up into so it just depends, I think, on the development, but I certainly am open to being incorrect here in the definition of living dwellings. It could be an apartment, but typically those are just situated on a single
Single
story, but not all.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go on. My thought is that the difference between multiple family and townhouse, multiple family tends to have more of a shared entrance, whereas and potential shared corridors or elevators or what
Yes.
have you, whereas townhouse tends to be between these two walls on either side is entirely mine or entirely a single residence. It doesn't have any shared facilities.
And maybe my mistake is I was visualizing a townhouse as something like what's on Burlington right now, whereas it's from the ground up, it's one person's unit. It's not that is put on top of a first floor that is a retail use, and maybe it's not considered that.
When I visualize a townhome, I visualize walking in on a ground floor. Each townhome has its own entrance. And then looking at that with that definition in my mind, isn't that a dwelling at the ground floor?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So there's some inconsistency unless I'm defining townhome wrong.
So our definition of a townhouse is a building that consists of a row of 3 or more attached dwelling units that share common firewalls, where each unit has its own individual exterior entrance.
So then you're walking into, unless you have to walk up the stairs after you walk in the entrance. Yeah, that would meet the definition. Okay, so then there is a distinction.
And it could be, they're typically, they tend not to be rental, they tend to be condominiumized.
Yes.
Right.
And in that case, the non-residential, if there was non-residential on the first floor, would be a condo, would be condominiumized. In other words, someone would buy that space. But your entrance would be your own to go into your multiple.
And the townhome could have a garage at the ground floor as well, right? And then there's no
Yeah,
dwelling.
it would depend on how it was set up, but yeah.
But to your point, if dwelling at the ground floor is special use, then dwelling townhouse can't be permitted use at the same time.
And that's why I would make dwelling ground floor, dwelling multiple family, dwelling townhouse, all special use for consistency.
And I would say dwelling ground floor should not be allowed if we're in the B1 tot, if that we're trying to achieve something. It's a fairly small area, and if you're going to allow residents in that fairly small area for, 40 feet wide, it seems inconsistent with what supposedly we're trying to achieve.
It's something you could also ask for clarification from the consultant on.
Definitely.
It could be just something was missed and there's no great philosophical thing we're missing.
That also could certainly be true.
There are other errors in the use tables that
Yeah,
we've seen.
it seems like it's,
Yeah.
and probably that, that's the kind of thing where it shouldn't happen that way, but sometimes consultants, they say, we want to find out if you're interested before we proofread. It can create some problems.
Right.
I also saw a tension between this new statement of a minimum height of 24 feet for buildings. I think it's in the B1 and the B2. And sometimes it seems like that's because, in the discussion, that's because some businesses just want a really tall first floor, but other times it's mentioned like, well, we want to have 2 stories. So we want to sort of set a minimum so that we're forcing people to build a 2-story building. And it wasn't clear to me what the philosophy was behind it, 24.
Yeah, I think that in these transit-oriented developments, there's a focus on greater density. So like, it's an interesting dialogue, because usually when you have developers, they want to pack as much in as they can per square foot, and you're saying, wait, we don't want it too dense. But in these developments, like there's one in Schaumburg where we were in negotiations with the developer, and they were like, well, we don't know if we can sell all this. It's like, no, we got to have these stories. We have to have it this, these buildings this close together, because that's what it is. So I think that's where some of that comes from. It's a focus on creating more density, again, to create this transit-oriented, like people are going to be focused on, staying close to the train and not,
The discussion with the steering committee was, if there is redevelopment, say on Burlington and the CBD, allowing 1 floor would be a wasted opportunity. To return to Elena's
Yeah,
point,
think the
that
idea.
Increased density.
That's the idea.
But then some of the discussion was, well, we're setting it at 24 feet, we're not mentioning stories, and I think the consultant misstated that right now, there is a 2-story limit. There is no minimum limit, I believe, in B1 or B2. But they said, well, we're changing it from 2 stories to 24 foot so that someone could have a single story that's really tall. And that seems inconsistent with what you're now saying, Chairman Mateo. So that's why I see that tension.
I'm not sure.
This is not very dense if you still have 1 story, but it's just 24 feet tall. You're not increasing the density.
Well, if some of the buildings in the CBD that are currently 12 feet, 1 story.
Right.
If that's
14
redeveloped,
feet.
we're saying, no, you have to have at least 24 feet.
But it could be in a single story. And
Right.
the consultant said, we like that because nowadays, lots of retail spaces want a really tall ceiling.
Well, it was Jeff Cermak's recommendation, actually. He's a commercial architect?
Realtor, I believe.
Realtor.
Broker or something.
He pointed out, so our first discussions were, let's include a minimum and have it be 2 stories. And then Jeff pointed out, Starbucks might want to come in, and they don't want 2 stories. They don't want to have apartments upstairs. They're perfectly willing to have a 24-foot tall business.
I got the feeling it was partially also to create that street wall.
Yeah, some of it is aesthetic.
Yes.
Yeah,
That
absolutely.
was somewhat where that 24 feet came from, rather than 2 stories, is that you can still, you have that imaginary Starbucks, and it's very tall, and so it still contributes to that facade look.
To create a street mass.
Yes.
What
Yes.
is the current height of most of those 1-story, buildings in the B2 CBD? Does anyone have an idea? I looked at them. I don't know if they're 16 feet, 18 feet.
I'm not certain, haven't taken a look. I would imagine they're anywhere from, a 10 foot to 16, 18 feet, probably. They could be tall, but not necessarily allowing additional height on top of that. And so there's definitely something to be said from a planning perspective of a pedestrian, that pedestrian flow, that pedestrian eye line, where that 2 stories is very comfortable for people to look at. And then you see little differentiations as that height changes, but you definitely notice when it goes between a 1-story to a 2-story kind
Yeah,
of building.
I think part of it is if you're familiar with the children's book, The Little House, where the skyscrapers are built around this little house that started out in the country. It's to avoid having, somebody build something new and everything is this high, and then here's this little thing there.
It goes back to that frontage look, that very gaining more consistency.
So currently, a restaurant with drive-through facilities is special use in B1C. The proposed use table has it blank for TOD. Do we want to include it? I don't remember any reason for exclusion.
The only thing that I can come up with would be that when you look at the area of the proposed TOD, the adjacent area behind that property are predominantly residential, residentially zoned, and, if there's a drive-through going in those,
Well,
in and out of those I don't know.
That's
Maybe
logical,
that's why.
But they're proposing that a retail sales establishment with drive-through facility be a special use in TOD.
Yeah, that's another inconsistency perhaps. The only property I can think of that you could do that is then the one right next to the train tracks. But then that's a very congested area, so I don't know if you'd want a lot of cars driving in and out. So,
Maybe they're thinking banks, like
the bank that's there, yeah.
where the old Bank of America.
Right.
That was a
has the
drive-through.
Well, they actually have a blank for financial institution with drive-through facility. It's on the page just
Right.
prior.
It's special in the B1C and
And that's
not
permitted.
permitted in the TOD.
So the bank is permitted, but a retail sales establishment with drive-through facilities is a special use.
Actually, the bank is not permitted.
Yeah, a bank is not permitted, a restaurant is not permitted, but a retail drive-through is permitted, and I honestly can't think of an example of what that would be.
I would pitch that back to the consultant and ask them to justify that, otherwise I would,
Maybe
I would make the
cleaner,
argument that for consistency.
We can do that.
Add it to the list.
Okay.
And you're right, I was mistaken. Financial institution drive-through is not permitted.
But it's currently a special use.
It's a special use B1C,
Correct.
yeah.
Okay.
Other thoughts?
Okay.
On the electrical vehicle charging station, trying to think this through a little bit, but right now, it's a new category. It's a special use for the B1C, the B1TC, and the B1 TOD. It was made a special use. I would think it would be appropriate to make it a permitted use for the B1C. If you think it, where the B1C is now, the two corners of Harlem. I don't know why we insist on special use for those locations. If someone wanted to put in an electrical vehicle charging station there. So that's one thought.
Thoughts on that?
I think that makes sense, given the nature of those two sites.
What about in the B2? Leave them all as special? There's the retail for, the mixed use, and the public use.
So the definition of electrical vehicle charging station, I think one of my thoughts was that maybe there should be different categories. One that's for use of people who are in the establishment, work in the establishment, like office or residences or whatever, and one that's for retail. And I don't know if you recall if there is that distinction, but in the public use area for the B2 public use, I don't think we'd want a retail electrical vehicle charging station, but you might want one being used by government employees or
I think
library employees.
I think if you draw the distinction between accessory uses and it being a separate use on the property, whereas if it's for the use of your employees at the government office, that's an accessory use, but if it was just a place where you just come and pay and park your car there, then that's something different. It's not accessory to the business that's happening there. So this might be about talking about it as a primary use.
It is, yeah, I think.
Principal use. In which case, I'm okay with it as a principal use being a special use, but permitted as an accessory use.
So the definition of an electric vehicle charging station just sort of describes it functionally, what it is, and the different levels of charging. Doesn't talk about it being, for retail or non-retail.
I think if we add the little principal use in parentheses that we have after parking lots, that might cover it. Since we allow parking lots as accessory uses, we could also allow electric vehicle charging systems as accessory uses, but not as the principal use of the property.
Okay, so we would recommend that there be a distinction between principal use and accessory use, and that in B1 TOD, that all other B1 would be a special use for a principal electric vehicle station, and then a permitted in B1 TOD, accessory electric charging station would be permitted in B2. Do I have that right? It's a accessory use, it would be permitted for B2. As a principal use in the B1 TOD, it would be permitted. Is that correct? And then
All of
all
the-
others would be a special use?
Accessory for all of the B2, or I was just talking about the B2 public use?
Correct. It would just be accessory use in B2 would be, well, would it be permitted or special use? For
I would think-
if it's
I
to
think
the, use of that office building, is that a permitted use or a
I
special
would
use?
make it permitted.
Okay. That's what I thought I had.
Because
If it's
because it's I'm saying
Yeah.
permitted as an accessory use.
Correct.
But if it's primary, then make it special.
It would be a special use, correct.
And maybe not allowed at all in the public use, the B2PU or whatever it's called.
Hmm.
The public, the governmental properties.
Okay.
We just need to make sure that what we're proposing lines up with 10.810, the part of the text that explains the standards for charging stations. Any other thoughts?
Okay. Thank you very much this is a lot of material. If you have additional questions, thoughts, anything, please contact me. You send me questions. We'll follow up with some of the items from our consultant and come back to you next month with additional discussion. Okay.
What do you guys think of the memo? Was it laid out in a way that was linear enough for you to work through?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, it was.
I thought it was great.
Good.
Thank you.
Well,
So that
thank you. Glad it worked. Okay.
Okay, next on our agenda, continued discussion of pervious and impervious surface zoning calculations.
Okay, so at the November 22nd, 2021 meeting, Planning and Zoning Commission asked staff to further research nearby communities and the policies that they have in place regarding impervious surface calculations. After doing some research and some material provided by Commissioner Brahm, staff found that most communities have a maximum percentage allowed on their lots. Some of them take into consideration permeable pavers or permeable surfaces. And those that do will essentially give a discount to the total impervious surface percentage on a property. Other communities like Riverside, for example, and I believe Park Ridge was one of them as well. I did a little bit of research into them. They don't give any sort of consideration for permeable surfaces, so whatever surface is on the lot, that goes toward the percentage. And I have a little bit of information. I included a chart, but I also looked into some more communities earlier today when I was speaking to Chairperson Mateo. So as I mentioned, Park Ridge doesn't give any sort of discount on permeable or regarding permeable pavers on a property. Hinsdale does, but that is that depends on the property itself. When I was speaking to the to the engineer there, he stated that depending on the layout of the property, whether it was, I think the example he gave was if it's if they're talking about a driveway, if that particular driveway is at an angle or sloped, they don't really consider that toward the total percentage because that water's there's gonna be some runoff, as opposed to permeable pavers on a driveway that is, at grade and it's not at any angle. They're gonna consider that material. Western Springs does do a discount, so it depends on the lot size. For example, if it's a lot that's larger than 9,000 square feet, they can have up to 54% lot coverage with surfaces. If it's less than 9,000 square feet, they're allowed up to 52%. So Western Springs, their cap is 50%, but if the lot is larger than 9,000 square feet, you get an additional 4% if you're using permeable pavers. If it's less than 9,000 square feet, you get an additional 2% kind of allotment toward that property. LaGrange Park, I spoke to someone in the building department there. They stated that property owners, there is an incentive for property owners to use permeable pavers, but it's only a small discount that they get toward the total percentage. And they typically will hand that off to their engineer to review. Most of the municipalities here will send that review off to whether they have an engineer in-house or they have an engineer that they use to ensure that the pavers are installed correctly. And the information that Commissioner Brahm gave me was with regards to Evanston. So this one is similar to some of these other ones. They receive a 25% discount on impervious surface calculations. Other paving blocks receive a 20% discount. Concrete and asphalt don't receive any sort of consideration. And they also have decks, and I think it was LaGrange, that does something similar where they will give a discount depending on, I think LaGrange, if it's open slats and the surface beneath it is permeable, the homeowners receive a discount of total percentage, and Evanston does decks that are not roofed and feature a permeable surface underneath, covering up to 3% of the total zoning area are excluded from the impervious surface calculation. Any portion exceeding 3% of the total zoning lot area counts towards the impervious surface calculation at 100%. So that was what I was able to find. I wasn't able to get in touch with a couple of communities, but I'm going to reach out again because I kind of want to see how they also look into their calculations. So if you have any questions or any other guidance as to maybe what you want to see with the next at the next meeting regarding the calculations.
I think you're on the right track, and that's some kind of discount would be discount credit, whatever we're calling this. I think you're getting a lot of different ideas, which is good, that we can then think about.
Did you get a sense of how these villages set their 20% or 25% or whatever? Is it?
Not yet. I think some of them. I think some of them just have to do with how big the lots maybe are, or how just past experiences. But I can reach out and figure out how they got that
Wondering
number.
how people do that. For instance, I was thinking, like, let's say someone puts down, grasscrete. Effectively, it's 100% permeable. Yes, there are little concrete, divisions, but all the water is going into the underlying ground, as long as that ground is permeable and it's not compacted gravel or something like that. And that's the kind of thing I'm looking for, like some, real facts about.
And I think
how
LaGrange
permeable things
Park,
are.
and I think LaGrange Park, what they do is when they go through the review process, they send it to an engineer, to their engineer, and that engineer then, I believe, determines, from what the proposed plans include, what that percentage is going to be. But I can double check and ensure that.
I think a lot of it is averages, because these permeable structures, none of them is perfect, and they start to degrade immediately. And so they sort of take an average of how much water on an average will this permeable, if it was done everywhere, save in runoff. And then they come up with an average for a percent, and it's conservative, so you're not encouraging even more water. You hope to get a net reduction. And you
Right.
try to encourage it by giving some kind of credit as a stimulant to that, but thinking that if the number is low enough to still get encouragement, you're going to get more water out of the storm system and if you have combined sewers, out of that system, which is even worse. I think that's how engineers do it.
Yeah, and that's all I'm looking for, is like
Yeah.
the real numbers on how it's done, because someone must have done this. And
Yeah, they
there's-
ran the.
It costs a lot more money to put in permeable pavers, or maybe no more for pervious asphalt. I don't think anyone uses that, but I've seen videos about how well that works. And I just wanted, if we want to encourage it, we need to give people an appropriate percentage of credit, but still not be overly generous if it's not really working.
If it's not really working. Right.
What is Oak Park's? Just says between.
Yeah, I missed that one. Let me check.
Just says between.
I know. No, I know. I believe the percentage for allowed, lot coverage and impervious surface was, I believe it was anywhere between 50 and 65%. But they don't do, like some of these other communities, they don't give a consideration to permeable material.
And were you able to get information from MWRD and how they calculate such things?
So I believe I'm sorry, I don't have the specific calculations from MWRD. I did take a look at it because you had asked. They don't require, as we discussed before, they don't require stormwater management for residential properties unless they meet specific thresholds for other types of permitting as they pertain to other wetland and river areas. But they do talk about how green infrastructure is a permissible method for managing runoff and volume control, stormwater detention. So they also define it. So I pulled the definition because I thought it would be helpful in just at least exploring what specific types of materials we want to look at as replacement for whatever surfaces. So it just says that impervious surface area is a surface that does not readily allow for the infiltration of stormwater runoff into the ground, The areas include but are not limited to rooftops, asphalt or concrete pavement, compacted gravelled and ponded water at its normal water level, volume control practices, green infrastructure, or other areas which include but are not limited to non-compacted gravel, porous or permeable pavement, and bioretention, so rain gardens, bioswales, composed of an engineered soil mix that are designed to promote infiltration of stormwater runoff into the ground shall not be considered an impervious area. So at least it gives a general interpretation of how we might move forward with specific surfacing areas that we would find acceptable under a definition of X percentage credit for surface perviousness. So I'm sorry, Chair Mateo, we had the information at one point and just didn't pull it back out, but we can certainly bring that back.
Yeah, I know that their rules don't apply to residences, but
Right.
it was my memory from the Ames variation process that they still have what discounts they'll allow for commercial properties, and maybe that could serve as a starting point.
Yeah, it was just what must have been looking at, but didn't have it. Okay.
So we have a definition for impervious surface. Maybe in our next discussion, we can ponder that and see if we can make improvements to it. So who sent the document considering, what's it called? Considering decks as pervious surface? Is that from you? Did you send it?
Well, I sent that impervious definition from LaGrange, and it talks about that, yes, if you have a deck with slats that allows water to go through, and the ground underneath is pervious,
Right.
then it's not an impervious surface.
Well, this is from Rybrook, New York, and they were pondering including decks as pervious, and so they have examples from many, many, many other municipalities in terms of definitions and what's included and what's not included.
Okay.
So, since we can't remember who originated, maybe I'll share it with you for next time,
Sounds good. Thank you.
because we're not inventing a wheel. So
Wonderful.
yeah, we can discuss decks and pools, because in that document, they're inconsistent as to whether a pool is considered pervious. And then the gravel thing seems to be pretty consistent. If it's driven on, it's going to be compacted and it's impervious, whereas just gravel in your, part of your garden is pervious.
Yeah.
If there's no, like, plastic line underneath it.
By definition, the water has to be able to get through.
Yeah, so.
Okay.
Anything else that we want to see for next time? I mean, the idea of, and maybe I misinterpreted what you said, that the engineer makes the final calculation or the engineer determines something. Our goal still is to have something in our code that is as black and white as we can get.
Right.
So that there's no misinterpretation by residents or by future staff.
Yes, I would support that. This should not be going to a unknown result of an analysis that doesn't help anyone.
Including residents who are reading the definition and trying to figure out what they can do, or developers.
Thank you.
And then last on our old business, consideration of revised proposal regarding a variation at 40 Kimbark Road for a fence at a street yard and corner lot.
So at the, like I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting tonight, the the proposal was sent up to the Board of Trustees, and they reviewed it at their February 17th meeting. And they followed the recommendation of the Planning and Zoning Commission of the recommendation of denial for the variation, but they also put forth a revised proposal for a fence on the property. Let's see. So the revised proposal would have a 4-foot open fence coming out 5 feet from the property, from the side door. It would go to the back of the property and then closed off there at the garage. And the Board of Trustees reviewed this proposal that was brought forth by Trustee Pollock, and they felt that it was appropriate that it be sent back down to Planning and Zoning to be reviewed against the standards for a variation. And the Planning and Zoning can decide to uphold their original recommendation, or they can modify the recommendation, and then it would be brought back up to the Board of Trustees at the March 17th meeting.
To be clear, the board did not vote along with our recommendation. They overruled it.
Correct.
by
Yeah,
vote.
so the idea is kind of like on an appeal, on an administrative review, a court can affirm, can overturn, but it can also remand. So they're remanding, but with a creative sort of potential solution that Trustee Pollock came up with. So, but they didn't want to approve it without comments on that particular solution from the Planning and Zoning Commission.
So they're looking for a recommendation.
Yes, on that.
So,
Commissioner Hennigan?
yeah, can I clarify? We're considering this trustee
Correct,
Pollock
yeah,
proposal.
the trustee Pollock proposal.
Not this new
Correct.
fence
So
variation
correct.
proposal.
So the petitioner one, that was his revised proposal that he brought to the Board of Trustees that night, which the board didn't feel comfortable with, and then they put forth, Trustee Pollock put forth his recommendation.
Okay.
I have a, excuse me, I have a question with regard to Trustee Pollock's recommendation. Is there a reason why he did not connect the fence to the garage, close in the yard?
Oh, no.
Is
he
there any
would-
discussion?
Oh, no, I think that was just my mistake. I didn't draw the line there. No, but he would, they would enclose that as well. That was just my error.
And this,
To this, sorry.
oh, it's just say, this isn't intended to be to scale, correct?
No, it's not.
So there's more like 15 feet between the property line and the fence?
Correct, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
To the point of looking at the drawing again, did Trustee Pollock specifically say that the fence, the east wall of the fence, east line of the fence should start at the residence's corner? Or did Trustee Pollock, was he more in line with simply making sure that this fence captured the doorway of the house?
So he.
Does that
he-
make sense?
Kind of, yeah, Trustee Pollock, I think just wanted to go with that bump out where the door is to keep it just kind of consistent, but then also enclose that side door there.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And by code, without any variation, would they be able to put a fence between the back of the house going straight back to the garage?
On this south side of the, yes. So they would be able to essentially enclose from that back corner of the house to that front kind of corner of the garage.
Okay, so in this case, it's just moving out 5 feet from that
Correct.
line, going a little longer. Thank you.
Right, so a fence is allowed in the rear yard by right, but not in the street yard.
So essentially what the variation would be is to allow this fence to be 5 feet further south and thereby enable capturing, for lack of a better term, that door exit so that one could leave the building and be in a fenced area. Rather than if the fence was in its permitted location, one would exit the door and then be out in the side yard and then in full view of the street and any
Right, if the fence were in the rear yard.
Right.
It would either need a gate, or the owner would have to put, Mr. Sheeman would have to put a door in the back of the house.
Right.
So we've received more communications about this request, at least 2 that are in front of you. It'll be included in the board's packet. We don't need to read them. We also all received an email one, so I guess we had 3 additional comments about it, and none of them are in support of this request. I also note that from our January 26th meeting, when we made our recommendation of the 7 standards, the majority of us found that 4 of them were not met. That's the hardship difficulty, it being unique, detrimental to public welfare, and would alter the essential character of the neighborhood. And then finally, I'll note that Commissioner Matthews, who couldn't be here tonight because of work, is of the opinion that he doesn't get a vote because he's not here, but he did allow that he is not in favor of allowing the request. So he has changed his position. He's concerned that the ordinance is clear and a variation would set a problematic precedent. Thoughts? Discussion?
I'm favorable towards this proposal.
I'm sorry?
I'm favorable towards this proposal as trustee Pollock drew it. You know, the exactness of the drawing, I'm not sure about, but coming out 4 or 5 feet from the house, going straight back, and then linking to the garage in order to establish a private yard with a fence that's only 4 feet high and is open. I see it as, you know, fitting under the variation standards. Part of it is that I think for safety and just for general ability to use a portion of your own property when your property is a fairly small lot that is surrounded on 3 sides by public streets, and one of which is, well, the public alley in the back, which is largely blocked by the cement pad in the driveway, but it's, you know, it's being on a busy street for safety purposes. I think having a fence, if you can imagine children being in that backyard, whether they're visiting or they live there or whatever, I just think it's a reasonable proposal. I understand that the fact that there are many other properties in Riverside with corner lots that have either fences totally up to the sidewalk or hedges. For instance, the property on the other side of Kim Park, the one that borders Park and Woodside, you know, that do create blockages, that do create barriers. You know, I understand that all those were probably put into place before the regulation that we're talking about now was established. But I think it's a reasonable proposal.
Other thoughts?
I'm just trying to decide if that door on the side of the house is a unique enough circumstance. That's sort of what I'm wrestling with.
This is certainly close to what I was implying last time around. I'm somewhat, I'm taking into account the community thoughts as well.
Commissioner Brahm, any thoughts?
I certainly do like the proposal set forth much better than the original one. I like the fact that the fence is lower. I like the fact that it's set back more and there's the line of sight that's not obstructed. I do think that the fact that this home is on on Forest, that it has a side yard that is street front, it's sort of a unique property in that sense. I do think the fact that it has a side door that would prohibit, if he was to build a fence as he is allowed to under the code, he wouldn't be able to capture that side door. And I do think that that can distinguish this property from other properties. I am struggling with the overwhelming public sentiment, or I don't know if it's overwhelming, but we do have very strong opposition. But I think that this proposal will need to perhaps go through all of the points again, the variation standards. But I think that this proposal it strikes a good balance between letting our resident enjoy his property while also keeping in mind and just the nature of Riverside and keeping it as beautiful as possible. This is a hard one.
Am I correct that if Mr. Sheeman wanted to build a fence directly from the southeast corner of his house back to the garage, so that would be the rear yard, he could make that a 6-foot fence?
Correct.
So that would be less friendly in appearance than a low 4-foot open slatted fence, and he could still make that choice if he wanted. So I think that has to be worked into it. I'm not sure if everyone understands what the other alternatives are here. For some reason, they just don't want a fence on this piece of property. And I think, one of the things that the other places where fences are shows is that the fact that someone has enclosed a street yard, like the properties on Kent and Selborne there, doesn't necessarily mean that it's unattractive.
Right.
So that's obviously all dependent upon the homeowner themselves and what they do.
I think that the proposed fence could look very attractive, perhaps much more attractive than a 6-foot fence. That's not including a side door.
Well, I think Commissioner Miller hit on some essential points, is that there is the potential for a 6-foot opaque wall that goes from the corner of the house to the garage, or, as was proposed or suggested by Trustee Pollock, a fence that is 5 feet closer to Forest, but is only 4 feet tall and is half open.
My concern is still the precedent. If we recommend this and the board approves it, then many other homeowners are going to want to put a fence in their street yard, even if it's their front yard. And especially when a fence can be built by right in the rear yard, achieving the effect. I think that's really setting a bad precedent.
Well, I think the distinction is that if you only had a single street yard, that would be one thing. But if we're only talking about corner yards, that's different. That's what this is a corner yard with an alley behind it. So I don't think it would set the precedent that all of a sudden everyone can put a fence in their street yard and our fence code is destroyed because we're allowing an encroachment of 5 feet into the street yard for half the length of the property. I mean, I just don't see it as, I mean, I understand the concern, but I don't see it as serious. Now, this was a very tiny variation, but I believe it was about a year ago where we allowed people over in Arlington to build 18 inches, a fence that goes 18 inches into their street yard. And, you know, that was minor, but we allowed it.
Well, shall we reverse order and go through the standards and then ask for a motion?
Sure.
Clarify something? There is an
Please go to the podium.
Because I didn't hear this on the top, this was brought up at the meeting. There's an existing fence on the north side, and so he's going to be able to build out 5 feet towards the sidewalk and then connect to his garage. And then he was told he could do a fence from his house to my fence, and then another one from his garage to my fence. I just want to clarify that. That was part of what they said.
That's correct. So.
Yeah, okay, very good.
Yes, just.
And I think the 4-foot tall fence that's open, I do think that it would look better than than the tall fence, but I have to say that I know there's people that have concerns because it will set a precedence. So that's up to you guys to figure out. But, you know, thank you.
I'd like to say something too as well, because at the last meeting, I think these were 2 separate entities. I think this whole process has been kind of backwards. For me to get pushed up to the trustee board to then kind of have a variation to come back to you, I thought it should have been a remix when, you know, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, Joel, but you had kind of almost talked about this identical kind of setup. And it really made no sense for me to go to this next meeting and then come back here, where even when I was talking to you guys in the previous meeting in January, that instead of it being a static thing, I thought it was like, hey, okay, this is what I want. And then obviously talking with Francisco, sometimes I'm asking, like, should I even put these plans in? Because I don't need to get shot down, you know, of what it is. And what's the worst I can do is put it in and see what you guys say. And since we didn't want to have, you know, not static, it was a static yes or no, there was no way to change it. So then going upwards made no sense to me to then get sent back down, although I know the trustee board could have trumped everything you said and they could have approved it on the variation that Mr. Pollack presented. But obviously he wanted your opinion as a planning and zone to see where it is. The unique thing that I thought that he brought into that equation was saying where her fence is, which is a vinyl fence, and which at this point you can't have vinyl, correct? That I can't have it, or it'd have to be some sort of wood grain texture on it. You know, it's open sight line. But then my whole point was, well, if I didn't do any of this variance, I could go 3 foot. If I didn't like her fence and it's nothing personal or whatever it is, you know, there's broken picket at the bottom, it's a little bit off the ground, I have a dog, that without the variance involved, they're 2 separate issues, that I could go 3 feet off of her fence and I could put any fence. If this variance had nothing to do with anything, I could, like right now, I could just throw this variance out the window. I could put my 6-foot fence along the back of my house to my garage, and I could do the identical thing on the side where her house is, correct? Without no one saying anything, because if I'm 3 feet off the property line, her fence is on the property line, it was already there prior, I could do those things. So there's 2 separate entities that, which I just wanted to have this meeting to figure out what we can do. But I feel like they're 2 separate entities, and I've talked to Francisco about it, but whatever, it was agreed upon to have that happen. I've never had a problem with you as a person, ever, until she's gotten personal in these meetings. She calls me out about some personal stuff, throws stuff in there about my trampoline, and that has nothing to do with the fence, and then wants to talk about my daughter and all these different things and get personal on family.
Let's stick to the
Exactly.
request, please.
But I'm just saying, we're appeasing somebody that really has nothing to do with the variance, because I'm asking for this little part of that 5 foot now, at this point. Her side of the fence has nothing to do with me. Because if this had nothing to do, these are 2 separate issues and 2 separate entities.
You're not considering the north edge
Yeah,
of your
okay,
property.
I understand that. But either way, I'm good with whatever happens. This process has been, to be honest, over the top. We're over-analyzing something like we're Congress at this point, talking about a fence. We're talking about 3 people that have wrote letters in. If you notice from the last variance, anyone that was approving it or good with it or had no problem with it didn't put a letter in because they didn't care. They were fine with it. So when 2 or 3 people put something in, we're saying an overwhelming majority. Just because a couple people don't like it doesn't mean the masses, are on the opposite end either. So I'm good with whatever you guys say. I'm just trying to get this done. The fact that we've gone to this many meetings, sitting here this many hours, to me seems wild. At the end of the day, if you had this same property, you'd want to absorb that side door in there. And I'm willing to negotiate, which is what we're doing now, to figure out what we can do. 5 feet, I don't think, is a big span of space. There's several other properties that have it to the sidewalk, like we've talked, and then hedgerow and all of those things. And I just want to try to get this done. Running circles around this, like this to me it is what it is. But at the end of the day, if this gets denied or whatever it is, in my understanding, from my house to the garage, I could put 6-foot tall privacy fences narrowed straight down. Correct? Okay. All right. Thank you.
So going through the standards, we don't have to be as formal because this is not part of the public hearing process. Hardship or difficulty?
I think the nature of this piece of property and its proximity to a busy street, and also the issue of not just cars going by, but also people going by, kids going by all the time, walking back and forth from school. So there's some interest, I think, that a property owner has in their privacy and being able to establish that with a fence that would create that privacy. So for me, the presence of this particular piece of property in the location that it is, the hardship does arise out of the lot and or the structures thereon. So that's what I think.
Well, a month ago, we were not able to identify hardship or difficulty. Has anything changed?
Well, for me, I think the difference is the exact proposal, because I think that a 6-foot fence right along the sidewalk was not tailored to the hardship that existed. Does that make sense?
Not entirely. When I think about it.
I think an additional hardship, which was not mentioned by Commissioner Miller, is the side door as well. We're capturing that side door entry with the new fence, so with the proposal.
I think I can understand where Commissioner Miller is going with a fence that is closer to the house and is designed to just capture the back door is much more tailored to the hardship, the limitations of the building, rather than a fence that went all the way to the property line. That was clearly not limited in its scope.
Commissioner Hennigan, any thoughts on the hardship and difficulty?
What we've been talking about with the different proposals, sort of addressing different issues, that makes a lot of sense to me. Struggling with this issue with the location of the door. And thinking back to the variation that we recommended approval of earlier this evening, where the location of the existing doors, for me, was a major factor of supporting that. So really, this isn't that different. So I do think there is a bit of a hardship here if we talk about wanting to have access to that backyard, with it being a fenced-in backyard. It's not reasonable to expect them to relocate the door. So I do think that that existing door location is a hardship. Others of the standards, I'm less sure about, but in my opinion, this does present a hardship, and based on the design that they're proposing, it's addressing that hardship.
I have nothing about construction, but I wonder as I sit here whether we don't know whether it's possible to relocate that door and at what expense it would be, because I understand there are bearing walls and things like that. You don't want to have too many piercings of walls. So we just don't know any facts about that, about what the cost might be of relocating that door. It might be more than we suspect.
The purpose of the variation is not based primarily upon a desire to increase financial gain. I think we still agree with that one, that is meant. The alleged difficulty or hardship has not been created by any person presently having an interest in the property. That one is met. Conditions upon which the petition for variation is based would not be applicable generally to other property within the same zoning classification. We did not find that one to be met last month.
And this one I continue to struggle with.
I think I voted that this was met last time because of the number of corner lots versus, particularly on this type of location, this size of a lot versus all the other corner lots in the village versus all the residential lots.
Well, again, just for corner lots, the location of the principal structure not being centrally located is not unusual. At least half the
I don't find that, I don't understand why, I don't think that's a important factor at all. I don't understand why.
Well,
the house not
that's
being
because the
centrally-
petitioner claimed that.
Yes, I know, but I'm not sure if it applies under D. I mean, I don't see how it impacts on D. I don't see that as one of the conditions upon which the petition for variance is based. I see the conditions more the existence of the regulation, because if this was any normal piece of property, he wouldn't have to ask us for a variation. So the conditions are the location of the property and the wording of the regulations.
Other thoughts on D?
I think that this property is uniquely located because the side of the property is on Forest, and Forest is the busy street. I recall our last meeting, there was a concern that the other properties on Forest were going to want yard fences as well in their front yards. But this isn't this property's front yard. This is the side of the house. He's encasing his yard, not the front yard, but the backyard.
But it's still considered a street yard.
I know, but we can distinguish between the other homes on Forest that face Forest. Their front yard then would be, I think this house is unique on Forest. Because the front of the house is on Kimbark, and it's actually the backyard that he's fencing in, not the front of the house.
And I think that's true on the opposite side of Forest also. There are no houses like this that have a street yard where you can see the backyard. It's on the side of the house.
Commissioner Hennigan, have you landed anywhere on that one?
This is difficult because in any other town with the grid-based development system, this type of property would be extremely common. But we just don't have the rectangular blocks here in Riverside aside from this tiny little portion. So it's not really the same as saying a corner lot in anywhere else throughout town. So it really is only comparable to a handful of properties. So I guess I am leaning towards it not being generally applicable simply because the rest of Riverside doesn't have these rectangular corner lots in the same way.
The granting of the variation will not be detrimental to the public welfare or injurious to other property or improvements in the neighborhood in which the property is located. We did not find that standard to have been met last month.
Again, I think I probably probably found that it had been met. But
I'm saying majority.
I know, I'm just saying, so I have nothing to say on this, I guess.
So what do we think now?
Well, in this case, with the fence being 15 feet from the sidewalk property line, that's not going to be visible from the front door of the property to the west, which is sort of a guidepost that I use for how it's going to impact the neighborhood. So I believe this standard is met with this current proposal.
Last month, I voted no on this point because the proposal that was presented to us had sightline issues and was 6 feet as opposed to 4 feet, was a solid fence as opposed to a 50% sort of visibility fence. So yeah, I think the standard has been met with this proposal.
Thoughts?
I have similar thoughts to Commissioner Brown, is that this proposal is substantially different than the at the property line and a solid fence. This is sufficiently different for me to be amenable to it.
Granting the variation will not alter the essential character of the neighborhood. That one we did not find to be met last month. Can't remember if Commissioner Pelletier commented on our landmark status regarding that standard.
She would have, and to be honest, I'm not, at this point, fitting in the other comments from the community. They don't quite apply to any one of these provisions that we look at, and I'm not sure where those fit when we consider things.
I think she did comment, or someone else commented, maybe one of the public commenters commented on the existence of the national landmark status. But again, as Commissioner Brahm said, that was with the 6-foot fence up to the sidewalk. I think this is quite different. I think we obviously do have a number of hedges enclosing street yards and fences, and that hasn't endangered our landmark status. And I'd also point out that if we allow a quarter-mile, half-mile long wall built by the Army Corps of Engineers, I think that's going to be a much greater endangerment to our landmark status than this 4-foot fence on one lot.
Other thoughts on the essential, what's the word, nature of the, essential character of the neighborhood? Proposed variation will not impair an adequate supply of light or air to adjacent property or substantially increase the congestion of public streets or increase the danger of fire or impair natural drainage or create drainage problems on adjacent properties or endanger the public safety or substantially diminish or impair property values within the neighborhood. Last month, we found that that standard had been met.
I agree, it's met with the current proposal.
Okay, having gone through the standards, would somebody like to make a motion for a recommendation to go back to the board?
I move that we recommend to the village board allowing the building of a 4-foot-high open fence roughly along the lines that is on this diagram labeled trustee Pollock proposal, with the understanding that this apparently is not quite to scale, but with the fence coming out south from the one point on the house, approximately 5 feet, and then running back, directly back to where the cement pad is. Is that sufficient?
It is,
Okay. Is there a second?
it's very good.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Final discussion?
I'll just say once more, I think this is a reasonable proposal if we look at the nature of this property and we think about what this fence means on this property, where this variation would be placing it in the grand scheme of things and the strictness of our code. I think this is an appropriate case for granting a variation.
Anything else? For the record, I don't find this to be a unique situation. I don't find that standard to have been met. Just FYI. Okay, call the roll, please.
All right. Commissioner Brum,
Aye.
Commissioner Marhol,
No.
Commissioner Miller,
Aye.
Commissioner Hennigan,
Aye.
and Chairperson Mateo.
No. Motion carries though, right?
It does, do we, and I'm sorry, I should know this off the top of my head, do we have a minimum number of votes to get a positive recommendation?
Not
I
sure.
can't recall. I should know it, I don't. But unless
Well,
there's
you could
that,
think
like.
That's not familiar.
Is
Okay,
a
then
majority
it
of
passes.
quorum?
Then it passes, what?
Would it be a majority of quorum?
No,
or
it
is
always is
just-
that.
Yes.
But some codes require, if you have a 7-member board, they require 4 affirmative votes to have it count as a positive recommendation. But I don't think you have
I
that.
don't believe that's the
Yeah.
case.
That was my only comment, but it does pass 3-2 as a positive recommendation with that vote. Obviously, you had a couple people missing, and the board will do what it wants to do, so,
As they do.
yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. We have no new business. Information, as noted earlier, our next meeting is March 23rd. If you know you can't make it, please also let me know, like Commissioner Hannigan has.
March 23rd.
Third,
March 3rd.
23rd.
March 20th.
With that, motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Please call the roll.
Commissioner Braun,
Aye.
Commissioner Hennigan,
Aye.
Commissioner Marhol,
Aye.
Commissioner Miller,
Aye.
Chairperson Mateo.
Aye. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next month. Stay healthy.
Nice to see everybody. Good night.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.